Imagine standing at your college registrar's office, ready to pay the final tuition that secures your future, only to be told your fully funded account is empty. I stood there, clutching a graduation cap that suddenly felt like a cruel joke. An hour later, my father sat in the front row of the auditorium, clapping for other people's children, looking me in the eye with a pride that was entirely hollow. He spent 20 years teaching me that numbers never lie, but he forgot that he'd raised an auditor. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him in front of the cheering crowd. I just went home, sat on my floor, and pulled the one digital record he thought stayed buried in the family archives, the audit trail. That single trail of breadcrumbs didn't just show where my tuition went. It led me straight to a modest suburban house 3 towns over, where a woman I'd never met was raising 2 children on my stolen inheritance. My name is Harper Vance, and until 3 months ago, I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, believing my family was the gold standard of financial integrity. My father, Alistair Vance, wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a pillar of the community, a man who built a local empire on the promise of transparency. He'd sit me down every Sunday evening in his mahogany-paneled office, showing me spreadsheets and explaining the Vance Education Trust. It was supposed to be my safety net, funded by my late grandfather's estate and years of Alistair's disciplined saving. He made sure I understood the weight of that responsibility. I worked through every summer break, took on high-pressure internships, and lived in a cramped studio apartment just to prove I was worthy of the legacy he was supposedly protecting for me. My mother, Lydia, was the quiet supporter, never once questioning the locked filing cabinets or the late-night consultation calls Alistair claimed were for business expansion. We were the perfect American success story, until the numbers finally stopped adding up. The payment declined notification at the registrar's office wasn't just a technical glitch. It was the first crack in a dam that had been holding back 15 years of calculated lies. I realized then that my father hadn't been investing in my future. He'd been subsidizing a second life I wasn't supposed to know existed. Before I take you into the forensic trail that dismantled his double life, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps these stories reach others who might be going through something similar. And I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from today? And what is the local time where you are? I read every single one of your comments, and your support means the world to me. Now let's get back to the day the ledger stopped making sense and the truth started coming out. Growing up in the Vance household meant living by a code. In Charlotte, the Vance name wasn't just a label on our mailbox. It was a brand associated with reliability. My father, Alistair, made sure I understood that from the time I was old enough to count. Every Sunday evening, while other kids were watching cartoons or playing in their backyards, I was summoned to his mahogany-paneled office. The room always smelled of expensive leather and old books, a scent that I once associated with safety and wisdom. He'd sit me in the oversized leather chair opposite his desk, spread out his weekly ledgers, and treat me like a junior partner in a high-stakes firm. "Look here, Harper," he'd say, pointing a gold-capped pen at a column of figures. "Money is a language. If you learn to speak it, you'll never be powerless. And remember, numbers are the only things in this world that can't betray you. People have motives, spreadsheets only have facts." I believed him. I hung on to every word as if it were scripture. He taught me the difference between an asset and a liability before I even knew how to drive. He made me feel special, like we were part of an elite club where transparency was the membership fee. This was the foundation of the Vance Education Trust. He'd show me the monthly contributions he was supposedly making into an account in my name. He told me it was my grandfather's legacy, a sacred fund meant to ensure I never had to compromise my integrity for a paycheck. My mother, Lydia, was the silent architect of this illusion. She was the heart of our home, always busy in her garden or organizing charity galas for the local arts council. She adored Alistair. She looked at him with a level of devotion that made any kind of questioning feel like a betrayal. To her, Alistair was the rock. He handled the boring stuff, the bills, the investments, the taxes, so she could focus on the beauty of life. She never asked to see the binders he kept locked in his desk. She never wondered why certain business trips lasted a day longer than planned. In her mind, Alistair was a man of his word because he had never given her a reason to think otherwise. I followed her lead. I was so busy trying to be the perfect Vance that I never looked for the shadows. I spent my high school years maintaining a 4.0 GPA and my college years working 50-hour weeks during my internships, all to prove I was worthy of the fund he was guarding. I thought I was being a partner. I thought we were building something together. I even felt a sense of pride when he'd tell our neighbors, "Harper's got my head for numbers. She's going to be the best auditor this state has ever seen." The irony is almost unbearable now. He was literally training the person who would eventually dismantle his entire life. He gave me the tools, the logic, and the obsession with detail that I would later use to trace his every lie. He thought he was teaching me how to manage wealth, but he was actually teaching me how to catch a thief. And the biggest thief in my life was sitting right across the desk from me, smiling as he adjusted his cufflinks and told me how much he valued our partnership. The air in the registrar's office always felt thin, like they'd sucked out all the oxygen to keep the archives from aging. I was standing there, my backpack heavy with textbooks I'd spent my summer savings on, ready to hand over the final $18,450 to clear my account for graduation. The woman behind the desk, Mrs. Gable, didn't even look up when she swiped my card. She just waited for the chime. But the chime didn't come. Instead, there was a harsh digital buzz. A red box flashed on her monitor. Transaction declined, insufficient funds. "Try it again," I said, my voice steady but my heart starting to drum against my ribs. "There's a trust fund. It's a Vance account. There should be a 6-figure balance." She tried it again. Same buzz, same red box. She looked at me then, her eyes softening into that specific kind of pity reserved for students who didn't realize they were broke. "I'm sorry, Harper. The bank is reporting a balance of $12.42. $12. I walked out of the building into the humid Charlotte afternoon, the sun reflecting off the glass buildings like a taunt. I called Alistair immediately. I expected panic. I expected him to be calling the bank manager and demanding heads on a platter. Instead, when he picked up, his voice was like silk. "Harper, sweetheart, you caught me in a meeting," he said, and I could hear the clink of silverware in the background. He wasn't in a meeting, he was at lunch. "The tuition? Oh, don't worry about that. There must be a glitch with the quarterly transfer, or maybe the market dip last month triggered a temporary hold on the liquid assets. I'll call the advisor on Monday. Just tell them it's being handled." "Monday is the deadline, Dad," I said. "They won't let me walk if the ledger isn't clear." "Then don't walk," he said, and the silk in his voice sharpened into something cold. "A piece of paper doesn't define a Vance. We are defined by how we handle ourselves under pressure. Now I have to go. Trust the process, Harper." He hung up, and in that silence, I realized that for the first time in 22 years, I didn't trust him. I didn't go back to my apartment. I drove straight to the family house. I knew my mother was at her garden club and Alistair wouldn't be back until late. I used my key, walked past the framed photos of our perfect life, and went straight to the mahogany-paneled office. The room smelled of Alistair's lies, the leather, the expensive scotch, the arrogance. I sat in the chair he'd trained me in. I opened his laptop. He'd never changed the password. It was Transparency 2020. Another irony that felt like a slap. I wasn't a daughter looking for reassurance anymore. I was a junior auditor looking for a discrepancy. I logged into the Vance Education Trust portal. I expected to see a mistake, a misplaced decimal, a delayed wire. Instead, I saw a void. The account history showed a series of massive withdrawals over the last 3 years. $50,000 here, $75,000 there. The most recent one was just last week. $20,000 moved out the day before my tuition was due. But it didn't go to the university. It went to an account labeled Evergreen Property Management. My father had told me that numbers were the only things that couldn't betray you. He was right. The numbers weren't lying to me. They were telling me that my father had been systematically draining my future for years. Every Sunday evening, partnership meeting had been a performance to keep me from looking at the stagehands. I felt a cold, clinical detachment settle over me. I pulled out a thumb drive and began downloading the statements. I didn't cry. I didn't call him back to argue. I just watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. I was going to follow the money, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care where the trail ended. I took the blue audit binder from the shelf, the one he'd taught me to use for simulated audits when I was a teenager, and I started a real one. Evergreen Property Management was about to become the most expensive mistake Alistair Vance ever made. The blue light of the monitor was the only thing illuminating the office. I sat there, the hum of the external hard drive sounding like a death rattle for the version of my father I had loved for 22 years. Alistair Vance had always said that if you want to hide a lie, you bury it in plain sight, usually under a pile of boring paperwork. He thought I'd be too distracted by the graduation parties and the job offers to look at the boring stuff. He was wrong. I started with the Secretary of State's website. In North Carolina, business registrations are public if you know how to navigate the portal. I typed in Evergreen Property Management, LLC. My hands were cold, but my mind was operating with a clinical precision I didn't know I possessed. The search result popped up in less than 3 seconds. The LLC had been formed exactly 15 years ago, the same year my grandfather had passed away and the Vance Education Trust was established. The registered agent wasn't Alistair Vance. It was a woman named Catherine Miller. I felt a sharp, icy needle of intuition prick the back of my neck. I opened a second tab and pulled up the property tax records for Portland, a quiet town about 2 hours away from Charlotte. I searched for any property managed by Evergreen. One address appeared, 4428 Willow Lane. It was a modest 4-bedroom colonial, the kind of house Alistair built for middle-class families every day. But when I pulled the deed, I saw the owner was the LLC. And the mortgage? The mortgage was being serviced by a joint account at a regional bank I recognized. I went back to the downloaded bank statements from my father's office computer. I began a cross-reference search, a technique I'd practiced 100 times in my accounting labs. I looked for the number $4,000. There it was. Every first business day of the month, for 15 years, $4,000 was wired from my education trust to the Evergreen Property Management account. I did the math on a yellow legal pad I found on Alistair's desk. Over 15 years, that was $720,000. My entire future, my grandfather's entire legacy, had been siphoned off in monthly increments. But it wasn't just the mortgage. As I dug deeper into the PDF folders labeled site expenses, I found scans of utility bills, grocery delivery receipts, and even private school tuition invoices for a Lincoln Elementary in Portland. All of them were paid by the LLC. All of that money came from my trust. I found a folder buried 3 layers deep in the system, titled Maintenance Records 2010-2024. Inside were photos. I expected to see plumbing repairs or roof inspections. Instead, I saw a digital album of a life I didn't recognize. There was a photo of a little girl blowing out 5 candles on a birthday cake, a girl who had my father's eyes. There was a photo of a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing next to Alistair in front of that house on Willow Lane. They were both holding fishing rods, and my father was laughing, really laughing, in a way he never did at home. In the corner of one photo, a woman stood, Catherine Miller. She looked like my mother, Lydia, but younger, with a smile that suggested she didn't have to keep up any appearances. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Alistair wasn't just embezzling money. He was funding a parallel existence. My education trust was the bedrock of a second family's survival. While I was taking extra shifts at the firm to save for textbooks, my father was using my grandfather's money to buy a boy his first bicycle and pay for a girl's dance lessons. I looked at the blue audit binder on the desk. Alistair had used it to teach me how to find discrepancies. Well, I had found one. A discrepancy worth nearly $1 million and a lifetime of betrayal. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to scream, to break the expensive Scotch decanter on the shelf, to wake my mother up and show her the wreckage. But I remembered the first rule of auditing: maintain professional skepticism. Emotional outbursts don't win court cases, documentation does. I began to print. The printer started its slow, rhythmic whirring, spitting out pages of wire transfers, LLC registrations, and the smoking gun, a mortgage application for the Willow Lane property where Alistair Vance had listed himself as the primary guarantor and Catherine Miller as the spouse. He hadn't just lied to me, he had committed multiple counts of fraud to sustain this double life. I spent the next 4 hours building the most important file of my life. I organized the wire transfers by year. I highlighted the signatures where Alistair had clearly forged my mother's name to authorize the transfers. I mapped out the timeline of when my grandfather's money entered the trust and how quickly it left for the secret family in Portland. By 4 a.m., I had a 3-inch binder full of Alistair Vance's secrets. I sat back in the chair, my eyes burning from the screen glare, and looked at the family portrait on the wall. The three of us, Alistair, Lydia, and me, smiling in front of the Charlotte house. It looked like a lie. It was a lie. I pulled the thumb drive out of the laptop and tucked it into my pocket. I had the audit trail. Now I needed to see the property with my own eyes. I needed to see the woman and the children who were living on the stolen pieces of my life. I walked out of the office, closing the door softly. I didn't look back. I had 180 miles to drive, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I was going. The drive from Charlotte to Portland took exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes. I know because I stared at the digital clock on my dashboard every time the highway slowed down. The blue audit binder was sitting on the passenger seat, a 3-inch thick collection of wire transfers and LLC filings that felt heavier than a lead weight. My mind kept looping back to Alistair's voice in the office. Numbers are the only things that don't betray you. I wondered if he realized that those same numbers were now acting as a GPS, guiding me straight to the heart of his greatest lie. Portland is a quiet town, the kind of place where people move to disappear into a peaceful suburban routine. As I turned onto Willow Lane, the air felt different, cooler, more honest. I slowed my car as I approached number 4428. It was a sage green colonial with white shutters and a well-manicured lawn that looked suspiciously like the work of a man who owned a construction empire. There were flower beds filled with yellow marigolds, my mother Lydia's favorite, though she didn't know she was sharing her taste with a ghost. I parked 3 houses down, tucked behind a large oak tree. I turned off the engine and waited. My hands were gripped so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. For 2 hours, I sat in that silence, watching the neighborhood come alive. A mail truck drove by. A neighbor walked a golden retriever. A group of kids on bicycles zoomed past, laughing. And then, at exactly 5:15 p.m., the black SUV turned onto the street. It was Alistair's car, not his work truck, but the luxury SUV he told my mother he only used for high-level client meetings in Raleigh. I felt a surge of nausea as he pulled into the driveway of the sage green house. He didn't look like a man who had just spent a day on a construction site. He looked like a man coming home. The front door of the house opened before he even turned off the engine. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She looked to be in her early 40s, wearing a simple sundress and holding a pitcher of lemonade. This was Catherine Miller. She wasn't a mistress in a cheap movie. She was a wife in every sense of the word. Behind her, 2 children exploded out of the house. A boy, about 10, wearing a local Little League jersey, and a girl, no older than 6, with blonde pigtails that bounced as she ran. "Daddy!" the little girl screamed, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet street. I watched through my windshield as Alistair Vance, the man who preached discipline and legacy, scooped the little girl into his arms and spun her around. He laughed, a deep, genuine sound I hadn't heard in years. He ruffled the boy's hair and then walked up the porch steps to Catherine. He kissed her on the cheek, and they stood there for a moment, talking about their day, before they all walked inside and closed the door. In that moment, the numbers in my blue binder finally took on human faces. That monthly $4,000 transfer wasn't just a figure on a ledger. It was the mortgage on that sage green house. It was the little league fees for the boy. It was the pigtails on the girl. It was the lemonade in the pitcher. Alistair hadn't just lost my college fund in a bad investment. He had deliberately stolen it, dollar by dollar, to buy a whole other life. My future was the fuel for their present. I sat in my car, staring at that closed front door, and I felt a cold, sharp clarity replace the shock. Every vacation my mother and I didn't take because the business was tight, every time I skipped a meal in college to save for a textbook, every night I worked until 2 a.m. at my internship. All of it was a sacrifice Alistair had forced me to make so he could play house 3 towns over. He had raised me to be a partner in his business, to respect the Vance name. But looking at that house, I realized the Vance name was a shell company. I was the silent investor who was being liquidated without her consent. I reached over and touched the audit binder. I thought about my mother, Lydia, back in Charlotte, probably preparing a quiet dinner and waiting for a man who was currently sitting at another table, eating a meal paid for by her own daughter's stolen inheritance. My mother was the primary victim of the fraud, but I was the one holding the evidence. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't storm up to the porch and scream. A younger, more emotional version of me might have done that, but Alistair had trained me better. He had taught me that a confrontation is only effective if you have the leverage to end the game. I picked up my phone and took a single photo of his SUV parked in that driveway. Then I took a photo of the house number. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the lights in the living room of the sage green house flicker on. They were settling in for the night. They thought they were safe. They thought the secret was buried under years of clever accounting and LLC filings. But they forgot that the person Alistair taught to read the trail was the same person he had robbed. I drove back toward Charlotte, but I wasn't the same girl who had left that morning. I was an auditor, and I was going to make sure that when the final balance was struck, Alistair Vance paid back every single cent he owed, plus interest. The drive back to Charlotte was a blur of gray asphalt and red taillights. I didn't stop for coffee. I didn't listen to the radio. I just let the silence of the car cabin hold the weight of what I had seen. In Portland, I had witnessed a man playing a role he'd perfected over 15 years, a loving father, a provider, a husband. But in my world, that man was a ghost, a hollow shell who had used my life to build someone else's sanctuary. I pulled into my apartment complex as the sun began to rise over the Charlotte skyline. I didn't go to bed. I went straight to my kitchen table, cleared off the unpaid mail and the half-finished accounting textbooks, and laid out the blue binder. I needed a second pair of eyes that didn't have the bias of a daughter. At 8 a.m., I called Sarah Beckett. Sarah was a senior auditor at the firm where I'd interned, a woman who treated financial records like a crime scene investigator treats a blood spatter. She was the one who taught me that an audit isn't just about math. It's about the story the math is trying to hide. "Harper, it's early," she said when she picked up, her voice thick with sleep. "I found the discrepancy, Sarah," I said. My voice was so flat it surprised me. "It's not a mistake. It's a second family, and it's $1 million fraud." 2 hours later, we were in Sarah's home office, surrounded by stacks of paper and the smell of stale espresso. Sarah sat across from me, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, scanning the mortgage application I'd brought from Portland. "He listed himself as the primary guarantor," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to me. "And Catherine Miller as the spouse. Harper, this is bank fraud. He signed this under penalty of perjury." "Look at the authorizations for the trust transfers," I said, sliding a folder toward her. "The bank requires 2 signatures for any withdrawal over $10,000 from the Vance Education Trust, my father's and my mother's." Sarah pulled out a magnifying glass. We compared the signature on the bank authorization to a birthday card my mother had sent me last year. On the cards, my mother Lydia always looped the L with a slight hesitation, a tiny hiccup in the ink. But on the bank documents, the signature was perfect. Too perfect. He's been forging her name for 15 years, I realized. The air in the room felt suddenly heavy. Every time he needed to pay that mortgage or cover a private school bill in Portland, he sat in his office and wrote my mother's name. He wasn't just stealing from me, Sarah. He was making her an unwitting accomplice to his own theft. Sarah leaned back, her face grim. Legally, Harper, you have enough here to file for a full accounting of the trust and a petition for restitution. We could go to the district attorney. This is wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. He could face years. No, I said. Not yet. Alistair Vance is a man of reputation. If I sue him now, he'll hire the best lawyers in the state. He'll bury the case in motions for 3 years, drain what's left of the assets to defend himself, and by the time we win, there will be nothing left for my mother. He'll make it a family misunderstanding in the eyes of the public. So what's the plan? Sarah asked. The plan is the Family Achievement Dinner, I said. Every year, the Charlotte Business League hosts a dinner to honor legacy families. This year, Alistair was the keynote speaker. He'd invited the whole family, my mother's sisters, the neighbors, the local press. He was planning to stand on that stage and talk about building a future for the next generation. I'm not going to sue him, I continued, my fingers tracing the edges of the blue binder. I'm going to audit him in front of everyone he's ever lied to. I'm going to make sure the cost of his double life is the one thing he values most, his name. Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then she nodded. You're not acting like a daughter, Harper. You're acting like a chief auditor. He's the one who taught me how to read the fine print, I said. It's only fair I show him what I've learned. We spent the next 4 days in that war room. We mapped out every transfer. We created charts showing the direct correlation between my missed tuition payments and the mortgage payments for the house on Willow Lane. We documented the forged signatures and the secret LLC. We prepared a dossier for every person who would be sitting at that head table. By Friday night, the binder was no longer just a collection of papers. It was a weapon. And as I put on my dress for the achievement dinner, I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a girl who'd lost her college fund. I saw the auditor who was about to strike the final balance. Alistair Vance had built his life on a foundation of lies. Tonight, I was going to pull the first brick. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in Charlotte was a cathedral of high society. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen tears, casting a sparkling, indifferent light over the city's elite. My father, Alistair Vance, was in his element. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, a glass of vintage champagne perpetually in his hand. He was the keynote speaker for the Family Achievement Dinner, an event designed to celebrate the pillars of the community. My mother, Lydia, sat beside him in a gown of midnight blue, her face beaming with the kind of pride that only comes from decades of blind devotion. I sat across from them, my own dress feeling like a suit of armor. Under my chair, tucked away from the prying eyes of the photographers, sat the blue audit binder. It was no longer just a collection of papers. It was a verdict. As the main course was cleared, the league president stood up and introduced Alistair as a man of unimpeachable integrity, a builder of dreams, and a father who defines the word legacy. The applause was deafening. Alistair stood, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked to the podium with the easy confidence of a man who believed his own lies. He began his speech. It was a masterpiece of rhetoric. He talked about the sacred trust between a builder and his client, and the even more sacred trust between a father and his child. He looked directly at me, his eyes softening with a scripted warmth. I've spent 20 years ensuring that my daughter, Harper, has every advantage, he said into the microphone. Because a Vance doesn't just build houses, we build futures. The Vance Education Trust isn't just an account, it's a promise of transparency and honor. The room erupted in a chorus of ahs and light applause. My mother reached for her tissue. My stomach turned. It was time. I didn't wait for him to finish. I didn't wait for the Q&A. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. I reached down, grabbed the blue binder, and walked toward the head table. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I kept my voice at a level, professional pitch, the auditor's voice. "Dad," I said, and the microphone on the podium caught it, broadcasting my voice through the speakers. "You're right. Transparency is everything." Alistair paused, a confused smile flickering on his face. "Harper, sweetheart, we're in the middle of an audit," I interrupted. I stepped up to the table where the league's directors sat. I opened the binder and began sliding identical folders across the white linen cloth. One for the president, one for the treasurer, one for the local news reporter sitting at table 4. And the last one I placed directly in front of my mother. "What is this?" Lydia whispered, her hands trembling as she touched the cover. "It's the Vance Education Trust, Mom," I said, my eyes locked on Alistair. "Or rather, it's what's left of it. On page 3, you'll find the mortgage filings for a property on Willow Lane in Portland. On page 5, you'll find the LLC registration for Evergreen Property Management, a company Dad set up using Grandpa's money." The room went into a vacuum of silence. The only sound was the rustle of paper as the directors began to flip through the folders. Alistair tried to grab my arm, but I stepped back. "Keep reading, Dad," I said, my voice cold as ice. "Go to the middle section. There are photos, high-definition ones. There's a boy about 10 and a girl about 6. They have your eyes, don't they? And that woman next to them, Catherine Miller. The bank records in that folder show that for 15 years, my tuition, my future, and Mom's retirement savings have been funding their life. Every monthly wire transfer is mapped out. $4,000 every month, signed off by you and forged by you in Mom's name." My mother opened the folder to the page with the photos. I saw the moment her heart broke. It wasn't a loud sound. It was the way her breath simply left her body, her hand going to her throat as she stared at the man she thought she knew. She looked at the photo of the little girl with the blonde pigtails, then at Alistair. "Alistair?" she whispered, the name sounding like a plea. He didn't look at her. He was staring at the folder in the league president's hands. He saw the wire transfer receipts. He saw the forged signatures. He saw the Vance legacy dissolving into a pile of fraudulent bank statements. The president of the business league stood up, his face pale. "Alistair, is this true?" Alistair opened his mouth to speak, to spin one last lie, but the numbers were right there in front of everyone. There was no market dip to blame, no bank error. There was only the audit trail, long, detailed, and undeniable. I looked around the room. The people who had just been applauding were now looking at Alistair with a mixture of horror and disgust. The photographers were snapping pictures, not of a pillar of the community, but of a man caught in the wreckage of a double life. "You taught me that numbers never lie, Dad," I said, stepping away from the podium. "You just forgot that I was the one you taught to count. The audit is complete, and you're officially in default." I turned and walked out of the ballroom. I didn't look back to see him fall. I didn't need to. I knew that in a room full of people who valued their names above all else, Alistair Vance had just lost the only thing he had left to spend. The silence that followed my exit from the ballroom wasn't empty. It was the sound of a legacy shattering. By the time I reached my apartment, the story was already hitting the local Charlotte business blogs. Alistair Vance, the man of integrity, was now the face of the city's biggest family scandal. My mother, Lydia, didn't call me that night. She stayed at a hotel, and the next morning, she did something she hadn't done in 30 years. She made a decision without asking for permission. She filed for an emergency injunction and a divorce on the grounds of fraud and embezzlement. The aftermath was clinical, just like the audit that started it. With the evidence in the blue binder, the court moved quickly. Alistair's business partners pulled their contracts within 72 hours, unwilling to be associated with a man who stole from his own daughter to fund a secret life. The Vance Education Trust was frozen, and through a restitution order, the remaining funds were redirected to cover my final tuition and my mother's legal fees. The secret family in Portland didn't survive the exposure either. Catherine Miller called me once, 3 weeks after the dinner. She sounded small, defeated. She claimed she didn't know the money was stolen. She thought Alistair was a traveling consultant with an inheritance of his own. I didn't argue with her. I just told her that the house on Willow Lane was now part of a legal recovery claim. Alistair had tried to build a sanctuary on a foundation of theft, and like any building with a rotten core, it collapsed the moment the weight of the truth hit it. As for Alistair, he lost everything. The silver-haired patriarch was reduced to a man sitting in a small rental apartment, facing a professional audit that would likely cost him his contractor's license. He tried to text me, calling me ungrateful, but I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The ledger was finally balanced. I graduated last month. There was no big party, no toast from my father. Just me, my mother, and Sarah Beckett at a quiet restaurant. I'm a junior auditor at a top firm now. Alistair was right about one thing. Numbers never lie. But he was wrong about the person who reads them. I didn't lose a father that night at the dinner. I lost an illusion. And in its place, I found a version of myself that doesn't need to be a partner in someone else's lies to be worthy. If this story has reminded you that boundaries aren't just walls, they're a form of self-respect, then please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep sharing these stories of justice and truth. And I want to leave you with one final thought. Have you ever had to choose between protecting a family secret and protecting your own future? Let me know in the comments. I'll be there reading and responding. My name is Harper Vance, and I've learned that the most important audit you'll ever perform is the one on your own life.